Finally, the last thing that I see in a general principle was, it was simple, it was specific, but it was powerful. Do you remember many months ago we were going through the camp of Israel, and I told you that if we superimposed just the tents of the nation of Israel in the wilderness on Tulsa, it would go from the river way out by Lewis and beyond all the way to 161st Street East in Broken Arrow. That would be the width of the camp, just the tents, 9 miles. And all the way from 91st Street up to Admiral. It's 81 square miles of camps. I mean, that's a lot of camp, tents and people. But look at this, verse 9. Put it on a pole. There was only one. And when anyone looked, they lived. You know what? This was powerful. Even though someone was on the outer fringe of the camp, even though someone was too weak to move, I started thinking about, you know what hundreds of thousands of people bitten by snakes would look like? Some of them would already be paralyzed and have that glassy look where the paralysis had set in and their eyes were starting to cloud and they were just barely alive. Others were starting to have convulsions as the venom went through their system and caused their organ or systemic failure. Others were probably already stiffened in death. And all these different conditions of these people with the snakes all crawling around, people screaming and the snakes attacking them. And the word began to fan out through the camp that off in the distance, 9 miles away for some of them, if they looked in faith, they could see that little tiny on the hill pole sticking up. And if they would just obey and look at that pole, it was very powerful. There's only one pole. But whoever looked at that healing sign, though from the outer parts of the camp, even though they were weak, even though their eyes were starting to cloud, they would be instantaneously healed. Isn't that a picture of salvation? It reminds me, whoever believes in Christ, though yet weak in faith, shall not perish. You know, Paul said there are weak brethren, and for those Christ died. There are some people who have very weak faith, but it's not the power of the faith, it's the power of the cure, which is Christ lifted up. Well, if we were to summarize this is what I have written in my Bible. What is the promise of salvation that you can find from Numbers 21 that Jesus probably was emphasizing? I just kind of shared the story with you now. What would Nicodemus have gotten from this story? Number one, he would have gotten God's sufficiency. The lifted up bronze serpent was all that was needed to supply a complete cure. They didn't need offerings, and they didn't need all these different cleansings, and they didn't need to make pilgrimages. They didn't need to bring a dove and wring its neck, and they didn't need to do all that. They had one sufficient cure. That one offering was a complete cure. God's sufficiency. Salvation should always remind us of God's sufficiency. Secondly, their hopelessness. Look at verse 7. We have sinned. The people had to acknowledge their hopelessness. They were bitten. We are bitten. We have the SIN virus. We were born with it. We are infected. We are perishing apart from Christ's sacrifice. Their hopelessness. The snake's venom was deadly, just like sin is. The burning pain they were feeling. These serpents, by the way, are still there. God didn't bring these in from Mars or something, and He didn't create them for on the spot. If you travel, in fact, I read all the travel books. Our trips don't go there, by the way. They said that everywhere you go in the sands of that part of the desert, that you can see there are today tracks, these things you can see in the National Geographic. They're wriggling through the sand, and they're fiery red. They're still there. And one of the travel books I read said that some of them are 2 inches wide. Oh, man, can you imagine a 2-inch wide, fiery monster snake coming at you? Usually they go away from you. In our yard, we have many snakes in our yard. They always leave when they see us coming. These came toward you. Can you imagine that? Wow, their hopelessness, how desperate their burning pain reminded them of their need. And so Christ told Nicodemus, God's sufficient. That's all you need. You're hopeless. That's all you need. Thirdly, God's power. One snake on a pole worked no matter how many bites or how bad their condition. I mean, you didn't need to have several poles. You didn't need to look several times. It doesn't matter how many times you got bit, how close to death and frozen in paralysis from the snake bite you were. It doesn't matter how far away you were removed from the pole. We happen to be 2,000 years away from the pole ourselves. That's further than 9 miles, I might add. But no matter how removed, how bitten, or how close to death, the power of that one offering, one snake on a pole worked no matter how many bites or how bad their condition. The fourth truth I think that Jesus underlined, not only God's sufficiency, their hopelessness, and God's power, was their personal need. It couldn't be your mom would run up and look at the pole for you. It couldn't be your dad would run up and look at the pole for you and look at that bronze serpent. You had to look. And that's a danger we have. We have a lot of parents looking for their kids. We have a lot of wives looking for their husbands. We have a lot of husbands looking for their... You must look. It's personal. Their personal need. The antidote was only good for an individual. No one could look at the bronze serpent on the pole to get another one healed. They personally had to, verse 7, acknowledge their sin, acknowledge their need. Next, God's perfect solution. There was one source of hope and salvation that saved anyone of any age, of any family, anywhere in the camp. You know, that's neat. There's not a different gospel message for those who live in the first world. I always hear about the third world. What are we, the first or something? I mean, what is the second world? You know, they always talk about these third world nation. I mean, what's the second world? You know, there's not a gospel message for the first world, the second world, the third world. There's not one for children. There's not one for people that are real old and sickly. There's one solution. Any age, any person, any family. One solution. God's perfect solution. One source of hope and salvation. Save those of any age, of any family, anywhere in the camp. Next is God's reliability. The bronze serpent never failed to work, no matter how often they tried it. I mean, it always worked. Anybody in the camp that ever got bitten with this serpent during this situation, it always worked. If they looked, God healed them right then. Saved them. They didn't die. Wow. Finally, the last thing I think Jesus probably underlined in Nicodemus' heart was God's simple plan. It was an instant look that was required. It was easy, but it had to be at the only source of help. Salvation is simple. It's a simple remedy. Salvation is immediately powerful, but it's exclusive. There was one and only one hope they had. Well, let's go back to John 3 and see what Jesus did with this, okay? John chapter 3, and we're going to conclude there. You know, Jesus was just like the bronze serpent because the bronze serpent was in the form of the deadly venomous serpents, and Jesus was made in the likeness of sinful flesh in our place. Jesus was like the bronze serpent because he was lifted up on the cross like it was lifted up on the pole. So how did Jesus apply this?